Hello, everybody. Thank you all for listening in. Um, so my name is Anya. I recently started as an assistant professor at Georgia Tech Psychology, and I care about the relationship between language and thought, language and cognition in humans and in language models. So one thing that happened with this explosion of interest in large language models is a rise of what you might call as AI psychology, where you take a large language model and you run a cognitive assessment on it like you would run on a human. And so then claims come out about the ability of these models to have theory of mind and do theory of mind tasks. We heard some of that yesterday. People tried to estimate its working memory, personality traits, political biases, and some go as far as saying, well, maybe we can stop running studies on humans and just run it on language models. And the impetus behind all of these studies is that what we care about is not necessarily large language models like models of language, but as models of cognition and intelligence more broadly. And Adele alluded to the fact that indeed we care not about language as just the system of rules and patterns, but about using language to do things in the world and share information. And ultimately, this kind of approach goes all the way back to the Turing test, where you have a human observer that's interacting either with another human or an AI system through a chatbot interface. And if we bracket off the whole task of distinguishing whether it's a human or a machine, the underlying goal is using language to get at underlying cognition, using language to figure out what's going on underneath the hood. And it makes perfect sense because language is a system devised to transmit thoughts from one mind to another. So if I want to know what's going on in your head, the easiest way is to ask. But I think it's possible to take that relationship too far and start conflating language and thought. And we do that sometimes with humans as well. If you're listening to a speaker who's very eloquent and persuasive, maybe a politician, I don't know, you might be kind of taken in, even if the content of the speech is kind of vacuous. And importantly, this is happening with language model as well, and not just the recent ones, even the chatbot Eliza from decades ago, people would anthropomorphize it because it was using language, because up to now, the only entities that were able to produce language were other humans, so beings with intelligence and feelings and intentions. And these models are breaking our heuristics now because we have language and thought is not always there, certainly not there for these very simple chatbots from decades ago. And so the main point that I want to bring to you is that when we evaluate large language models, we should dissociate language and cognition, intelligence, or thought, however you might call it. So not arguing that these models only have one or the other, but when we run the assessments, when we try to see what they're capable of doing, we should try to keep those as separate as possible, even though in practice it gets messy, and we'll get to that. And so today I want to tell you first about the framework my co-authors and I have come up with to try and separate out language and thought, and that relies on the notion of formal and functional linguistic competence. I will then tell you about a specific domain of functional competence that I am very interested in, generalized world knowledge, and I think it's a cool domain because that's actually where the formal functional distinction gets a bit messy. And conclude briefly with implications for the future and building better models. All right, so the formal and functional distinction really stems from the research in cognitive neuroscience. So in the human brain, language processing takes place within its own separate network of brain regions. These are the regions that are sensitive to language at different levels: words, phrases, sentences. They are responsive during different kinds of language comprehension, like listening and reading, and different kinds of language production, like speaking and writing. They're sensitive to any language that you might know, and that includes sign languages as well. And the cool thing about these regions is that they're quite selective for language. So if you put somebody in an MRI machine and measure the strength of the response to different kinds of language, you see that the response is quite strong. But the response is low or non-existent to many other kinds of cognitive tasks if they're not presented to you in language form. So different kinds of math and logical reasoning, problem solving, and conceptual knowledge, if they're not in language form, you will not see the language network come online. And this kind of evidence from brain imaging is nicely complemented with evidence from people who might have had a stroke, and so their language system got severely damaged. So these are examples of some of these people's brains with really huge lesions in the left hemisphere. So this is the top-down view. And in fact, as you might expect, these people have severe issues with language production and comprehension both. But it turns out that if the damage is primarily restricted to the language network, a lot of other functions remain intact, the ability to reason about cause and effect, socially communicate, even if it's not with language. Some people like to play chess on the weekends, and so remarkable capacities are still there even when language is gone. And so it's very interesting that we have this system in the brain that seems to be responsible for core language knowledge. But the system doesn't operate in isolation. The language network alone will not give you language. What happens is that it interacts with all kinds of other systems in the brain responsible for our social interactions, for different kinds of grounded world knowledge, for general problem solving. And so in real life, language dynamically interacts with all of those systems where the information goes back and forth in order to enable successful language use. And what we can do is we can try to group these capabilities into two clusters. So one group is formal linguistic competence. So these are language-specific capabilities that take place, that happen within the language network. And the other group is functional linguistic competence. So these are non-language specific capabilities like problem solving, social reasoning, world knowledge. So you can use them even when the input is not linguistic, but these are all the capabilities that you need in order to use language to achieve your goals in the world. And so an example of a formal competence is a sentence like the keys to the cabinet are on the table. So the classical subject verb agreement task, knowing that the verb here is are and not is. And the cool thing is that most of the formal competence capabilities are solved by large language models today. And you could argue that GPT-2 and definitely GPT-3 has started to produce grammatical, coherent language that conforms to this definition of formal competence. And that's really a remarkable achievement. We did not have models that can do that. That's very cool. And one reason why we didn't have that before is models that are built on symbolic logical rules are brittle and break for all of the reasons that Adele just mentioned. And so now we have a model that just seamlessly generates language, and it should not be overlooked. And that's not something that most linguists were expecting before. On the other hand, functional competence, you might think of an example like this. 6 birds were sitting on a tree, 3 flew away, but then 1 came back. There are now 4 birds. So if you're trying to generate a paragraph like that, you need to predict the next word being 4. So the word itself is linguistic, but really to get at the answer, you need to do this relevant calculation, this basic arithmetic. So mathematical reasoning is an example of functional competence. And so these kinds of tasks can be challenging for language models, not this example necessarily, but lots of formal reasoning, math, and social reasoning tasks is where we see model performance, be kind of patchy, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And moreover, oftentimes their performance might rely on memorization of specific examples or very similar examples, or basic heuristics where, we don't think that that's how the problem needs to be solved. And we heard examples of that yesterday as well. And this is actually the reason why in the past year or so we've seen this shift away from pure network prediction to RLHF fine-tuning and alternatively coupling a language model with additional modules that maybe will help it do math better, like a calculator. And so we see this distinction play out quite a lot. And if you want to learn more, we have this review paper with my colleague Kyle Mahawald, who you heard from yesterday, and F. Fedorenko, who did all of this work on the language network in the brain, and other wonderful co-authors. All right. Well, so formal and functional linguistic competence is a distinction that keeps popping up over and over again. Kind of once you see it, it's hard to unsee, I would say. But there are domains where it gets kind of complicated, and one such domain is world knowledge. And the reason why it's complicated is that language contains a lot of information about the world. So it contains lots of factual information, like Paris is the capital of France, or maybe generic statements like birds lay eggs. But maybe even more interestingly, it contains a lot of distributional information. So you have sentences about the color of the sky, like the sky is blue today, the sky was black, the sky is pink. And so from that, a model can extract the probable colors that a sky might take. And so it's this kind of distributional knowledge that I'm going to be talking about today. And so all of this information in language is very rich, very exciting. Lots of this information is maybe easiest to get through language, but one problem is that this information is biased. So it doesn't faithfully reflect the stuff we see in the world. For example, I didn't just come up to you today and say, well, this morning my alarm rang and I got up and I brushed my teeth, right? All of the boring stuff I dropped. And I'm only talking to you about the stuff that's interesting and important and maybe not something that you expected to hear. And this phenomenon is known as the reporter bias. So the information that large language models are trained on and the information that humans receive through language is biased toward things that are maybe unusual and kind of hard to predict, non-obvious things. And one fun example I have of that, if you Google square wheels versus round wheels, square wheels actually has more results in Google than round wheels. And the reason why, it's, well, why would you ever specify that the wheels are round? It's kind of obvious. So you might expect that models that are trained on data like that, might have trouble figuring out which is more likely, square wheels or round wheels. And hopefully we'll hear from Alex in a little bit about the fact that meaning in the brain is distributed. So if you're using an encoding model based on language, you will be able to predict lots of brain responses in areas going beyond just the language network. So it's really a functional competence that we're talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about two projects. Hopefully I have time for that. And in the first project, we looked at generalized event knowledge in large language models with my colleague Karina Kauf. And so when we talk about generalized event knowledge, this is this classic concept from cognitive science. These are templates of common events we observe in the world. So having these templates will allow you to reason that a sentence like the fox chased the rabbit is a pretty typical event, but the rabbit chased the fox is not as typical, not as plausible, and the fox chased the rabbit is also kind of weird and probably implausible as well. So not Wikipedia style knowledge, very basic facts about events that tend to happen in the world. And so what we asked is, does generalized event knowledge naturally arise in pre-trained language models? So before we get to fine-tuning and RLHF, right, does this objective of just capturing patterns in corpora via next word prediction give you generalized event knowledge? And we looked at two types of sentences. So we're swapping the subject and the object to manipulate plausibility. And in one case, this swap is between an animate and inanimate entity. So the teacher bought the laptop versus the laptop bought the teacher. If you just use the literal interpretation of the laptop bought the teacher, that is just an impossible event. It just cannot happen. And so it turns out that models are actually quite good at distinguishing these possible and impossible events. So humans here are at ceiling, and then the large language models that aren't even that large, we have GPT-2 here, are actually also pretty close to ceiling as well. Moreover, in blue, we have some very, basic by today's standards language model baselines, and even they do actually kind of okay. So that information is very much present there in the linguistic signal. We then also looked at a different kind of events. So we have two animate entities, like the fox chased the rabbit versus the rabbit chased the fox. And the rabbit chased the fox is not impossible. It can definitely happen. It's just less likely. And so when we ask humans and models to distinguish likely and unlikely events, we actually see that models don't perform as well. Large language models are above chance, but not quite at human level. And then our baselines are actually pretty much at chance. And so this phenomenon where models do well on impossible sentences, but poorly on unlikely, we called the gap between the impossible and the unlikely. And there are many possible reasons for why we might observe this, one being the reporter bias, unlikely events being overrepresented in the corpus. Or we can try to put a formal functional competence gloss on it and say, well, the impossible events violate the selectional restrictions of the verb, this idea from linguistics where if you have a verb like bought that requires an animate subject, then it's really a linguistic property of that verb. And so it's a very salient signal that something is wrong here. Whereas unlikely events, they rely more on graded event knowledge. And so we can say that that actually maybe goes more in the realm of functional linguistic competence. And that kind of results makes testable predictions for what we might observe in the human brain as well. All right, but next we've decided to go beyond that. We are going beyond just simple single sentence events and trying to do a much deeper dive into world knowledge across different domains. And so in fact, we have just released the website for this project called EWOC, Elements of World Knowledge. So you are the first ones hearing about it. And so with my co-lead authors, Alex Satt and Ben Lipkin, and a huge team of other amazing authors, we constructed stimuli testing world knowledge in many different kinds of domains that we know are essential for humans who are trying to construct models of the world. And in fact, most of these domains rely on dedicated neural machinery in the human brain. And so the one thing that the previous study is limited by is the fact that strings like the fox chased the rabbit maybe are just more common in the corpus, so just memorizing that sequence might be enough. And so here we're trying to get around that where the same target sentence is likely given context two, but context one, but unlikely given context two, and vice versa for the second target. And so if we look at an example from, say, spatial relations, we can have a context that is a minimal pair. Object one is in front of agent one turns left, or object one is in front of agent one turns right. And then the target, object one is right of agent one is left of agent one. So both contexts and targets are minimal pairs, and we can combine them by filling objects with different kinds of object nouns and agents with different kind of, say, names. And so we can generate a large number of specific items that all test the same relation, where C1 plus T1 is accurate, makes sense. C1 and C2 and T1 maybe not as much. And so we tested 20 open weight models from Hugging Face on all of these different domains. So our best performing domain is social interactions, testing cases like helping and hindering and chasing and evading. And we see that models still aren't perfect. Their accuracy is not at 1, but it's pretty close, especially for the larger models. And here, each dot, by the way, is a different version of a data set generated by filling in the template with different objects or different names. So we see that actually affects model performance quite substantially. On the other end of the spectrum, we have spatial relations, so left, right, north, south, close, far. And here we see that models actually perform quite poorly, above chance, but there is a long way to go. And the gray area here is the range of human performance on different versions. Humans aren't perfect for interesting reasons in this case. You can ask me later. But the important thing is that the gulf between human performance and model performance there is quite huge. And we can look at the results for all the other domains. We see, again, that it's fairly challenging. No models reach human, well, most domains in the models don't reach human performance. And the general trend we see is that social stuff tends to be easier and physical and spatial relations tend to be hard. And we tested to make sure that it's not linguistic properties of the stimulus of formal competence that drives differences across these domains. And so the takeaway is that basic world knowledge in large language models varies drastically by domain, with social knowledge outperforming physical and spatial knowledge. We did not design this data set to be challenging. We actually thought that the models would do quite well in it. The sentences are fairly simple. And EWOC is not just one data set, it's a framework. You can generate your own templates. You can fill them in with whatever variables you might want. So we very much encourage you to build on it and use it. Okay, super briefly, implications for better language models. The formal functional distinction has two implications, and one is targeted evaluations that look separately at formal and functional competence. And actually, Helm, this amazing platform coming out of Stanford, at some point had this distinction, I don't know if it still does, where you have different benchmarks for language and knowledge and reasoning. And each individual benchmark, I think, can also do a better job of trying to isolate those different components. In EWOC, we realized that actually, if we're trying to test functional competence, we cannot just quite get away from the formal. So what we did is we annotated the items with, does it use active, passive? Does it use negation? Other linguistic things that might affect performance beyond just the functional competence stuff. And on the other side, if we really take inspiration from the human brain, we would expect models of language use to be modular with maybe a large language model paired with external modules, like we have a language network communicating with other networks in the human brain. And so one way of doing this modularity is architectural, like with these modules being built in advance, but it doesn't have to be the case. We might actually have emergent modularity where these modules emerge in the model over the course of training if the architecture is set up in a way that is conducive to it. And maybe you need specific kind of training data, specific kinds of objective functions. So you don't have to build models, the modules in advance. And the goal, of course, is that a brain-like model of language use will result in human-like language use. So the formal competence, knowledge of linguistic roles and patterns, functional competence, non-language specific skills required for later life language use. The distinction is grounded in neuroscience, hopefully helps to clarify the discourse around large language models and develop targeted assessments of their capabilities. And I would like to thank all my co-authors, especially my colleagues and my mentors, and everybody for your attention.